So this is the case that goes along with chapter 6 that I was talking about in that lecture. And this is where, again, this is not fraudulent financial reporting. This is where the company's the victim. So what happened was the couple of the authors from the textbook got the data from an oil refinery, and they just said, you know what, let's just be proactive and just look for fraud. We don't have any tips. We don't have any evidence that somebody's committing fraud. But if we can get the data, we can help this oil refinery determine if there's anything suspicious at the organization. So the first thing that they do is they go through and identify, okay, if somebody were committing fraud at this oil refinery, how would they do it? And so they brainstormed and came up with potential fraud schemes. So they first thought, okay, what happens if the vendors are committing fraud on us? Well, then they're probably going to be overcharging for goods, and then providing poor quality goods, and then potentially billing more than once. So if these are the schemes that vendors could perpetrate on us, what are the red flags? If we can get the data and we can sort it and stratify it and look for outliers and do all those things, what are we going to find? Or what would be a red flag? So they just brainstormed and came up with some ideas and searches that would indicate red flags. So they're going to look for price increases greater than 30% for 4 years, or work orders and cost overruns that were greater than 50%. They look at a dollar amount, total number, or a percentage of goods returned to vendors. So they're going to look at returns to vendors, sorted by dollars, total number of returns, and then percentage returns related to what they buy. They're going to look for duplicate invoice numbers for specific vendors. So they can do that because they have the data. They can just look at what invoices per vendor were paid and are there any duplicates. Vendors with invoices for the same amount on the same day. Or vendors with sequential invoices. That's where you have a particular vendor who's selling you product and you look at their invoices and you have invoice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 from that vendor. So it doesn't appear that they have any other customers other than you. So you get every one of their invoices. That would be suspicious. They said, okay, well, what if, in another scheme, what if employees are committing fraud? Maybe they're just setting up fake vendors, dummy vendors, and then we're sending checks to fake vendors for goods or for services that we didn't receive. Or what if they're purchasing goods, but they're using it for their own personal use? So they're buying goods from the vendor, but then they're taking it home. So what are the red flags that we would expect to see if employees are doing either of these two schemes? Well, there might be 2 or more suppliers with the same telephone or address. They also want to get a list of their vendors and compare them to Dun & Bradstreet listings to see if these are actual companies. They look for contractors with common names, so they can do some searching. For the first 2 letters match and 90% of the name is the same. This is what we talked about, what was mentioned in chapter 6 called fuzzy matching. And that's where if you have a contractor and they have maybe not the exact same name, but the name's 90% the same, that you can do searches and identify that. Right? And even if, and other types of fuzzy matching would be if you wanted to look at suppliers with the same telephone number or address, well, maybe you're doing a search and you're trying to match addresses, and one of the addresses says Main Street, and they spell it out M-A-I-N-S-T-R-E-E-T, and then another employer has Main Street and it's M-A-I-N-S-T, right, period. Well, a fuzzy match would notice that even though technically those aren't the exact same, that they're essentially the same thing. They say the same thing, and that's what you can do with fuzzy matching. And so doing searches for that would be helpful. So employees and vendor addresses are the same. So you're sending vendor checks directly to an employee's house. Obviously, it would be a red flag related to fraud. And then invoices without purchase orders or purchase orders with $0 amounts. So all these potential red flags might indicate dummy vendors are purchasing goods for personal use. So what about if vendors and employees are colluding? So vendors and buyers are colluding. So the buyer at your organization is colluding with the vendor and getting kickbacks. So the red flags would be similar. You got price increases. You'd want to look for price increases greater than 30% for 4 years. Total dollar amount numbers or percent change, or percent of goods returns from vendors. Sort that, look for the outliers. Payments without receiving reports. So you paid somebody, but you don't have any record of having received any of the goods. increased volume of purchases by vendor or buyer. So is one buyer buying increasingly more product, or is one vendor selling in large quantities, increasingly large quantities to your organization? Or a combination of increased prices and increased purchases from specific vendors. So you want to do a search, we look for like 20% increase in prices and 20% increase in purchases. So what if contractors are committing fraud? Because occasionally they hire contractors to do work for them at the refinery. So the contractors would be charging more hours than worked, or they're billing excessive overtime, or they're just billing for hours, just overbilling hours they didn't work, or they're setting up fake employees, fake contractors, and sending in bills. Well, how could you identify that? Well, we could rank hours worked by contract employee. We could rank overtime hours worked in 2-week pay periods by contractor and employee. Ranking contractors using rising overtime rates. So again, ranking them and then looking what are the outliers? Who's getting the largest increase in overtime? Contractors with significant jumps in labor rates, or outliers in rates per hour. So your contractors are charging an amount per hour, or some charging you an amount that appears to be way too high. Sort contractor Social Security numbers by ascending order. Help potentially identify fake Social Security numbers. So what are the other things that we might see? So what are the findings? Well, the findings are the refinery was rejecting over 50% of goods received from 3 vendors due to poor quality. Now, that's over half the items that they're receiving from 3 vendors they were having to send back. 2 were small, but one of those vendors represented a purchase relationship with the oil refinery's largest vendors. So why is one of their largest vendors sending us product that we have to send back over half the time? Obviously a red flag that there's a potential vendor fraud or a kickback scheme between the vendor and the buyer. For that vendor, we'd have to look into that. 6 invoices were all found for the same amount from the same vendor on the same day, all for $1,044,000. Obviously suspicious. 3 invoices from the same vendor on the same day for the same items, each for $900,000. So it looks like they're getting double billed from that particular vendor. And then you have 6 employees had the same address as the vendors. There were 20 purchases over $100,000 where the quantity paid was greater than the quantity received. For one vendor, the company paid $56,201 for items with a unit price of 19 cents and 12 cents each. Obviously, that's suspicious, a red flag that would need to be looked into. In fact, the company didn't even need that volume of items. So there were 4 contractors and employees were reported to have worked over 150 hours for 20 consecutive 2-week pay periods. So that looks a little bit suspicious. How can they possibly be working that much? Employees of the company were submitting time cards from different locations for the same time period. So they were working in different places at the same time. There was one contractor where employees had an average of 2,046 hours of overtime for a year. In examining the average rate per craft by company and employee, per hour charges ranged from $56 to $15 for the same craft. So why are some people charging $56? Maybe there's contractor fraud going on. There were 7 companies whose invoices exceeded purchase order amounts by $100,000. The largest difference was $713,000 on an original invoice of $21,000. And then searching for vendors with sequential invoices revealed 19 vendors where over 50% of all invoices submitted were sequential. So again, it looks like you're the only customer basically. With one vendor, over 83% of invoices submitted were sequential. So you have 83% of their invoices. Appears to be that you're by far their largest buyer, so maybe there's something suspicious going on there. There were 3 companies from which goods had been purchased with 0 amount purchase orders. With all 3 of these companies, there were over 100 0 amount purchases. Then there were 9 contractors with cost overruns exceeding 50% and $100,000. The highest percentage cost overrun was 2,431%. So again, these are all red flags that demand looking into, that potentially fraud is being perpetrated against this organization. So the point is in conjunction to look at this Albrecht and Dunn article. This exercise they went to this oil refinery helps illustrate how you can be proactive and use data to search for fraud and search for these red flags. You don't have to wait for a tip. If you know these are the types of frauds that could be perpetrated at your organization, there's no reason to wait for tips or to wait until you suspect fraud. Internal audit could be running these searches on a regular basis, and they would catch these unusually large price increases, for example, early on. So if there is a vendor kickback scheme, you stop it before it gets too big. So there's no reason to wait, and you can see how powerful this data analysis can be in helping identify fraud.